Hey everyone, and hey Kim, how are you doing?
I'm excited for our conversation. I've been looking forward to it.
Likewise. Yeah, very exciting. We just launched Radical Respect as a video book, and just want to say hello again to all of our attendees. If you don't know me yet, I'm Ronak Sheth, founder and CEO here at LIT Videobooks. So, if you're not familiar with LIT yet, we make reading best-selling business books as fun and entertaining as watching a movie or a documentary. If you want more info, just stay tuned until the end of the chat. But for now, let's settle in for what I know is going to be a great conversation on radical respect and how to work together better with Kim Scott. We're going to save the last 15 minutes or so for a Q&A. You can pre-ask your questions in the Slido link that's going to be in the chat and upvote any questions you really want to hear the answer to. Kim, before we dive in, I'd love to share a little bit about your background with everyone. You've led teams at Google and Apple, become a best-selling author of Radical Candor and Radical Respect, co-founded Radical Candor to help teams work better together, and coached at companies like Dropbox and Twitter, taught at Apple University. I mean, the list goes on. Your journey is truly inspiring. You're a really big name in the learning and development and HR space as well, and a thought leader who's shaping how we think about leadership and workplace culture. We're really fortunate to have you here with us today. Would you maybe just share a little bit about your background and how your experience has shaped the amazing work that you do now?
Sure. I mean, I think probably I started thinking in a more serious way about what we have to do in order to build the kind of team where everybody can do the best work of their lives and build the best relationships of their careers. This happened probably when one thing you didn't mention, probably trying to be nice to me, was my three failed startups. And the first startup I founded was called Juice, and I started that company because I felt like I had not been treated respectfully in much of my career, and other people hadn't been as well, and I felt like that hurt my performance and hurt the collective performance of the team. And so I thought, well, when I start a company, if I'm in charge, everything's going to be awesome. You know, all that nonsense that happened at the other companies where I worked won't happen under me. And of course, just because I was the CEO and co-founder did not mean that human nature had changed. And so all the same nonsense happened. And it was very upsetting, but it was also really important. When I got to Google, I had the opportunity to work with Shona Brown, who led business operations there. And she designed all the management systems. And one of the things I learned from her is that if you're going to be a great leader, it's not enough to be a good person. It's not enough to have good intentions. You need to build real systems. Because if you don't design your management systems to be just, you're going to get systemic injustice every single time. And so I tried in Radical Respect to really spend more time digging into that, into what we can do, not just as leaders, but also as upstanders. And, when we mess up, as we're all bound to do, and when we get tripped up by friendly fire from our colleagues.
And I think it's such an important topic. And I guess, would you maybe share kind of what inspired you? What was the moment that inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, it came right after I was giving a talk about radical candor. If you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And some of the best feedback that I got came when I was doing a radical candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person who I like and respect enormously. And so I was really excited to give a talk to her team. When I finished, she pulled me aside and she said to me, Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I need in order to succeed. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would give people even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true as soon as she said it. And I knew how unfair that was because she's one of the most cheerful, reasonable people I've ever worked with. And that caused me to have four realizations at the same time. And these four different of the four different roles that I played in this, and these became kind of the chapters of the book. So the first thing that I realized was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to be an upstander. Instead, I had been a silent bystander. I had never taken into account the toll it must take on her to have to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together, even though she had what to be pissed off about, as we all do. So that's sort of one of the things I focus on in the book, and there's whole chapters about how to be an upstander. Now, the second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her in the workplace, I was also in denial about the times when I was the one who had been disrespected in different ways than she had, but still that kind of disrespect had come my way. And because I had pretended that it wasn't happening, I tended to default to silence instead of choosing a response. And over time, that kind of robbed me of agency. So kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit that I was pretending that a whole host of things were not happening, that were in fact happening. But that was really what was going on. And I think that was going on because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as the culprit. So this brings me to the third role that we all play sometimes, which is the person who is disrespectful. We all do this to each other in different ways at different times. And because I didn't want to ever think of myself as a culprit, I was most deeply in denial about the times when I was the one who was disrespectful. And then the fourth thing that I realized was that I imagined myself to be this leader who's creating these BS-free zones where everybody can do the best work of their lives and build the best relationship of their careers. But by pretending that these disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not happening on my teams, I was failing to prevent them. So those are the four roles. Sometimes we're the person who is an upstander, sometimes we're the person who was harmed, sometimes we're the person who caused harm, and sometimes we're the leader, and sometimes we're multiple of those roles at the same time. So that was sort of part of what I tried to explore in the book. It's what role can we play in creating a better work environment?
It's really fascinating. And, I think the radical candor framework and the 2x2, I'm glad that you were able to kind of create something similar for radical respect.
Yes.
It's just so easy to kind of retain, the information and remember it that way.
Yeah.
So, we want to go ahead and kind of take a look at a clip from the video book that kind of highlights the 2x2 and also kind of showcases where we can avoid some common pitfalls. So we're going to go ahead and play a short clip from the video book.
Awesome. Let's do it. You know me, I love a good 2x2. Radical respect is what happens when you optimize for collaboration rather than coercion, and for honoring everyone's individuality rather than demanding conformity. So what could possibly get in the way of radical respect? Let's talk about what happens when we fail on one dimension or another. Sometimes we remember to honor everyone's individuality, but we sort of coerce that kind of honor. We try to coerce people into thinking about the world the way we do. And that is what I call self-righteous shaming. And that is not a great way to create the best possible work environment. And there are other times when we do create a very collaborative work environment, but at the same time, we begin to demand conformity rather than honoring everyone's individuality. And that is what I call oblivious exclusion. And then there are times when we fail on both dimensions at the same time, where we are demanding conformity and we're trying to coerce others. And that is what I call brutal ineffectiveness. It's sort of the strength of the team is the individual, and the strength of the individual is the team. I do love a good 2x2, and I love the way that your team illustrated the 2x2, because I think it's really important to have positive target identification. We all want these kinds of respectful work environments. Nobody wants to work in a 1984 style dystopic, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of work environment. And I don't know about you, but I've never met anybody who says, "Oh yeah, what I really want to be is coerced at work." Innovation flourishes in freedom, and so we really need to make sure that we are optimizing for radical respect and understanding what gets in the way of that kind of respect.
Absolutely. And could you maybe share a little bit more about, the three quadrants that are not radical respect? How oblivious exclusion, shaming, and brutal ineffectiveness could show up in real life, with some examples.
Yeah. I mean, oblivious exclusion often shows up when we're making decisions, for example, about who to hire or who to promote, and we let bias creep into those decisions, for example, or even prejudice. Here's a story about how bias might creep in. I was advising a CEO, and he noticed that he didn't have any women on his team. And to his credit, he figured the problem was probably the promotion process, not the women on the team. And so he said to me, "Why don't you sit in, Kim?" He hired me to sit in on the promotion and to point out anything I noticed in the promotion committee meeting. And there were two people up for promotion at the same time, a man and a woman. Both of them were leading big businesses and had teams that were very well functioning and very committed to them. They had great leadership styles. And the woman's team was the woman's business was growing a little bit faster. It was a little bit bigger, and she had slightly fewer people, so she was more her business was more profitable. But sometimes that's more a function of just the business rather than the leader of the business. So we were talking about her leadership style, and we were also talking about the man's leadership style and who really deserved most to be promoted. And somebody referred to the man as a great leader, and then they referred to the woman as a real mother hen. And I was like, "All right, back the train up. We we can't. This is the problem." And at first they were a little defensive, and they were like, "Oh, Kim, it's no big deal. We didn't mean anything by it." And then I said, "Look, words matter. Words really matter. What is going on here?" And they sort of acknowledged that they needed to rethink how they were assessing the leadership style of the two people. I'm like, "Get real. Who are you going to promote? The real leader or the real mother hen?" So that was an example of oblivious exclusion. An example of self-righteous shaming came from a company that I know that where they wanted to have an offsite, and somebody said, "Let's have a powwow," and then everybody started attacking this person who recommended the powwow, that they were sort of not being respectful to Native Americans. And what nobody knew was that this person was Native American and was offering to share their culture, and it turned into this huge thing. So that's an example of oblivious exclusion. I mean, I think the sort of the worst of all worlds happens when we're not honoring anyone's individuality, and we're being coercive at the same time. That kind of environment is what you see with, for example, Harvey Weinstein. It's brutal and it's not effective.
Right. And Kim, what are some of the kind of misconceptions about respect in the workplace that you've encountered? And I guess how does the 2x2 challenge some of those notions?
Yeah. So respect in the workplace, I think it's worth going back to the dictionary because respect has two different meanings, and it's important to understand which one we're talking about. Respect, one meaning of respect is something I have to earn. So I have to earn respect. I have to earn your respect for being a great writer by writing a great book. But that's not the definition of respect that I'm using in this book. When I'm talking about radical respect, I'm talking about the kind of unconditional regard that we owe each other for our shared humanity. This is not something that we owe to people, but this is kind of a birthright that that we all have. And when we have that kind of respect in the workplace, then collaboration becomes much easier and we can be our fullest selves. And it's not possible to do our very best work if we can't be our very best self.
Yeah, and I guess, as a leader, what are the questions that, I should be asking or other leaders can be asking to understand where which quadrant they're falling into in some of their work interactions? Like what should we be kind of
Yeah.
asking ourselves
Yeah,
when
I mean,
something
I think
happens?
if we take a big step back from the 2 by 2 and we think about what gets in the way of radical respect, because this is what we all want. As I said before, nobody wants a dystopic 1984 style work environment. And I mean, there are leaders there are autocratic leaders who do want to create a coercive work environment, but I think most people understand that you're not going to get the best out of your team. Like, why bother hiring the best people for the job if you're not going to listen to a word they say? So most people recognize that we need to optimize for collaboration, not coercion. And so there's a million things that get in the way, but I'm going to boil it down to three. I think the big three things that get in the way of radical respect are bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think one of the problems with bias, prejudice, and bullying is that we tend to conflate those three things as though they're the same problem, but they're actually three very different problems. And I know that everyone on this call, everyone listening right now, is a problem solver. And what do you do if you're faced with a hard problem? You break it down into its component parts and solve them one at a time. You don't try to mix problems together. So one of the things I do in the book is try to offer people some very simple definitions for bias, prejudice, and bullying. So in the moment, you can figure out what you think you're dealing with and choose the right response. So bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. Bias I'm really talking about unconscious bias, whereas prejudice is meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying is just being mean. Bullying is not about a belief, conscious or unconscious. You're just trying to sort of dominate or coerce someone. And so I think it can be helpful, at least it has been helpful for me, when that thing happens. And I bet everyone on the call can think about a time just in the last week where somebody said or did something in a meeting that's so cringeworthy that it makes you want to crawl under the table. And so we so often don't say anything because we don't know what to say because we're like not even sure what we're confronting. So one of the things that I recommend in the book is to think about what to say when you don't know what to say.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really challenging thing to do. And, especially kind of in a public-ish setting when in a meeting, right? You don't know how to
Yeah.
act. So excited to kind of dive into some additional content that you share about how to react to these. And I think one of the challenging things is also how do you tell if something is bias or prejudice? Sometimes that line is pretty thin. I guess it's a little bit important for us to understand exactly what the differences are between each of these. So we're gonna just showcase a clip from the video book of you explaining these in a little bit more detail.
It goes without saying that we all want a respectful work environment. But what does that mean?
At the core, that means we need to learn how to recognize bias, prejudice, and bullying and figure out how to respond to those attitudes and behaviors. So what I would love to do is leave you with some simple definitions that'll help you distinguish between these three things.
Let's start with the first big problem, bias.
Bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. It's usually unconscious.
Second, prejudice.
Prejudice, I'm going to define as meaning it. It's a consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype.
And third, bullying.
Bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious whatsoever going on. It's just being mean.
And Kim, so I think bullying is clear. Everyone knows maybe when bullying is happening, but for bias and prejudice, what are, I guess, some of the common biases, prejudices, and bullying that go unnoticed in workplaces that can be really detrimental to teams?
Yeah, I mean, for me at least, what's helpful, I tend to assume that it's bias. I don't think the person really meant what they said. And sometimes I find out I'm wrong. So if it's bias, if I think it's bias, I'll reply with an I statement. And then often, depending on how they respond, I will learn that, oh, that was not bias. So for example, shortly after I returned to work after having kids, I had twins, and so I'd been out on parental leave for 5 months. And my second day in the office, I was chit-chatting with a guy right before the meeting, and he said to me, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And at that moment, this was like a gut punch for me because I had just, I was having all the feelings you have, right, when you return after parental leave. And but I didn't think he really meant it the way it sounded. And so I said, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I wanted to neglect my children." And I was expecting him to laugh and apologize and we would move on. But no, that's not what happened. He doubled down. And this is how I knew it was prejudice, because he said, "Oh no, Kim, you really don't understand. I'm going to send you some research. It's really bad for you, for your kids, that you're back at work." And so this is not unconscious bias. He really believes this. Anytime somebody offers you research, you know that especially if it's debatable. I mean, you can look at the research, but usually it's debatable, as his was, in fact. And so I know I needed an it statement to respond. And so what I said to him is, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me that I'm neglecting my kids by showing up at work." Like, the it statement sort of draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose those beliefs on others. And an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to a company policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So I chose company policy, and that had the desired impact. He kind of backed off. And then I said to him, but I could tell I hadn't really gotten through. So now I'm going to use another it statement that appeals to common sense. And I said, "It is my decision, together with my partner, how we are raising our children, just as it is your decision, together with your wife, how you are raising your children. And thank goodness you and I are not raising children together. Like, it's not relevant, your beliefs about how to raise kids, to our ability to work together." And he kind of chuckled, but I realized I needed a third one. So I used a third it statement, also appealing to common sense. I said, "It is my guess that you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research." So that kept us on and he laughed and he said that was true. And so we were able to move on. We didn't have to engage each other with this belief in order to work well.
It must have been hard. It must have been hard to kind of react to that in real time versus just kind of brushing it off and
Yes.
figuring out how to address it later, right? I think that's really challenging, and I think the it statements are really helpful for dealing with that.
And I'm probably exaggerating. This is probably more what I wish I had said. I probably didn't. I probably stumbled through it more in the moment, because I think, I mean, at least for me, I don't know what your experience is with this, but it's so tempting when somebody says or does something that's disrespectful to me. it's so tempting to just default to silence every single time because I'm acutely aware of the danger of speaking up. I'm less acutely aware of the danger of remaining silent. But as I mentioned before, one of the things I learned over the course of my career is that the big danger, there's a lot of dangers of remaining silent. The big one is that over time that robbed me of a sense of agency and left me feeling sort of cynical. You know, you know, what a jerk this guy is. I can't work with him. So it was really important for my own kind of mental well-being to say something, but it was also important to my ability to have a good working relationship with this guy. Because if I had remained silent, my resentment would have grown, and every time I saw him, I would have been pissed off, and that doesn't help you work better with others.
Absolutely. And I think you also mentioned there's kind of three types of statements that you can use for bias, prejudice, and bullying. And one of them is I, and you mentioned the it statement. And then there's also you. When do you utilize the you statement approach?
The use statement is what you can use in the face of bullying. And I learned this from my daughter, who, by the way, was the person who kept calling just there. So my daughter was getting bullied at one point on the playground, and this was a long time ago when she was in third grade, and I kept encouraging her to use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah 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 blah, and she banged her fist on the table. She rolled her eyes and she said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?" I'm like, oh. That's a really good point. So you don't want an I statement sort of brings someone in. It shows them, it's like holding up a mirror. It shows them how you understand the situation. And if someone is trying to bully you, they're just going to take advantage of that. You also don't want to use an it statement, because if someone is trying to bully you and you show them where a boundary is, you know what they're going to do. They're going to kick right past that boundary. And so if you think what's going on is bullying, you want a you statement, kind of pushes them away, a you response. A you response can be something like, if you feel like you can back this up, you can't talk to me like that. If that feels too aggressive, or that it might make the situation worse, you can use a question like, why are you behaving this way? What's going on for you here? And if that feels too risky, you can just use a you non sequitur. Where'd you get that shirt? The point of the you statement is that you're no longer accepting whatever this person is, whatever it is that this person is dishing out to you. You're not in a submissive role. You're in an active stance. You're making them engage with your question.
It's really interesting. And yeah, the clip with your daughter was brilliant. I mean, she's super smart at such a young age.
And super determined, as we just heard.
So, in the video book, you also address how detrimental and, unchecked power, how detrimental it can be to fostering a collaborative workspace. And, we're going to dive in and check out some of your advice, and then get your thoughts on how we can apply this to companies.
Unchecked power is the ability to make a decision without consulting anyone else. And the danger of unchecked power is that we make worse decisions and that we hurt people we don't intend to hurt.
There are dangerous dynamics that occur when power is added onto the three big problems.
When you layer power on top of bias or prejudice, you get discrimination. When you layer power on top of bullying, you get harassment. And when you layer power on top of touch, even just a handshake, you can get a physical violation.
Having worked in HR for over 2 decades, that is one of the main roles that we have in HR, which is to really provide a check and balance within an organization. And power can sometimes get really out of line, particularly as the more senior you go inside of an organization. So I found that to be a very useful tool.
Ernest is great.
I love working with Ernest. He's amazing.
Yeah, and Kim, one of the it can be really challenging, I think, for managers and leaders when they're not really looking in the mirror, right? So I guess what are the, some early warning signs that power is becoming unchecked and being abused by a leader or manager? And as a leader or manager, kind of what questions should you be asking yourself to really kind of be reflecting on your behavior?
I think the most important thing to ask yourself is, have I created systems on my team or at my company that ensure that no one person has unchecked decision-making power, unilateral decision-making power over who gets hired, how much people get paid, who gets promoted. When we're working on a team, it's really important that these are collaborative decisions. Because if I have unilateral decision-making power, now you are going to, even if I'm not going to take advantage, even if I'm a good person with good intentions, you might be afraid then to challenge me, because you might be afraid that I will not promote you or that I will fire you and that nobody can stop me from doing that. And then you're not gonna tell me things that I need to know. And so that's dangerous. It's dangerous for the company, because now there are things I don't know that I need to know. It's dangerous for our relationship, and it's bad for everyone around the two of us. And so it's really important to make sure that you are designing management systems that really measure what matters, that quantify bias at every stage of the employee life cycle, to make sure that you're not that bias is not impacting negatively who you decide to interview, that bias is not impacting negatively who you decide to hire, that bias is not creeping into your promotion systems, that bias is not creeping into your pay systems, because it will creep in unless you get very proactive about measuring what matters. I think the other thing that is really important to do is to make sure there are, checks and balances on your power. If I do something that you don't like and you don't feel safe coming to me, have I empowered HR so that HR can challenge me? And I think that a lot of leaders are hesitant to give HR the authority that it needs to challenge leaders. I mean, another thing that, for example, in Germany, you have to have on the board of directors someone who recognizes individual employees, who represents sort of the frontline workers at a company. And I think that's another great example of checks and balances that you can put in place on people's power.
And are there kind of examples that you have from companies that have kind of implemented systems that you really like similar to kind of the one you mentioned about the German board of directors? Is there like?
Yeah, absolutely. Atlassian has a policy called the No Brilliant Jerks policy. And this policy is that if you are a jerk to your colleagues, if you bully people, basically, that you're going to get a low rating, and ultimately you're going to get fired if you can't change your behavior. Of course, you'll get some feedback, because sometimes people bully others and they don't realize the impact of their behavior. So you want to give people feedback. But if someone can't stop it or won't stop bullying others, ultimately you have to not only not promote them and not give them a bonus, but you have to fire them. And sometimes this is difficult because this person might be playing some really important role at the company, but you know what? In the long run, it's better to have a hole than an asshole. That's what I'm going to say about that.
That's a great line.
Yes.
So Kim, our last clip today looks at the powerful role of the upstander, which can be really challenging to play that role. And so we're going to dive in and learn more in our last clip here today.
These are the ways we can respond when we are harmed. But there is immense power in being an upstander when we witness others being harmed too.
One of the reasons that I wrote Radical Respect is to thank all the upstanders in my career. One of my favorite stories comes from a colleague of mine. She had founded a company and she went into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. She sat at the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. And then her two colleagues sat to her left. So here they are at the table. And when the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to her left. The next person sat across from the guy to his left. And that's, by the way, often how bias shows up, just who sits next to whom. And then everybody else filed on in the room, down the table, leaving my colleague sitting there alone in the center of the table, dangling there by herself. And she started to talk, and when the other side had questions, they didn't direct them at her, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time, and one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think we should switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. An upstander is someone who observes a disrespectful attitude or behavior and intervenes in some way.
It's an amazing story. And I think, ideally everyone strives to be an upstander, but, in the moment we freeze. And I guess, what are the challenges that you see that prevent folks from becoming upstanders, even when they know that something that's happening is wrong? I mean, I know we could use more of this on the subway in New York City.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yes, absolutely. So there are, I think the big thing is fear, like fear that standing up will hurt us, fear that we'll say the wrong thing, fear that will actually make it worse for the person who is harmed. And so I want to offer people 5 different ways to think about being an upstander, because you can't always, like, maybe you wouldn't, I mean, I may not have been able to think of, oh, I think we should switch seats. Like, sometimes that kind of direct confrontation is hard to think of how to do, or it feels too risky, or it feels like it might make things worse. You can also just delay and just check in with the person who is harmed later. And this is really important to do. It can have a huge impact. An example of why it's important comes from a time when I was giving a presentation to this big team, like 5,000 people. And the leader of that team was going to introduce a couple of colleagues and me. So he introduced the first guy, shook his hand, introduced the second guy, shook his hand, introduced me, and I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And instead of shaking it, he kisses it, leaving a little spit on the back. It was one of those cringe moments. Not the end of the world, but kind of gross. But what was much worse than that was the fact that not a single one of the people in the audience came up to me afterwards and said, "Ooh, that was weird. Do you need a little hand sanitizer?" And then I started feeling I started gaslighting myself almost, like, am I making too big of a deal of it? Why didn't anybody else notice that this was strange? And so just checking in with the person who is harmed later can be an excellent gaslight dispelling action, and is a great way to be an upstander. I mean, another thing you can do is create a distraction. There's a funny story called Snack Man about somebody who intervened in what looked like maybe even was going to turn into a sexual assault. A woman was getting bullied on the subway, and somebody just spilled his potato chips. So you can create a distraction. Spill your coffee. You can also delegate. There's a lot of complicated psychological literature on why people are often the silent bystander. But if you feel like you're not the right person to intervene, you can catch someone else's eye and see if they will intervene. You can delegate up, down, or sideways. And last but not least, we're all carrying around these movie cameras in our pockets. You can document what happened. Remember that the person harmed owns the documentation. Like, don't go posting it on social media without checking in with them. But that can be a great way to. So those are 5 different things to think about, 5 different ways to be an upstander. And It's interesting. Let's go back to that story from the clip. Like, why did that guy say, I think we should switch seats? There's a bunch of different reasons why it's important to be an upstander. The first reason he did that was because he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew that if the other side wouldn't listen to her, they couldn't win the deal. So there's a practical side to this. There's a business rationale. The second reason that he did it was because he liked her and it bothered him to see her getting ignored. So there's an emotional side to this. There's also a third reason why he did it, I think, was not only did he like her, he also liked the people they were meeting with, that he was meeting with. And he knew that they would feel regretful if they realized what they were doing. He didn't think they were intentionally. And he also thought it would be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. It wasn't that he thought she couldn't speak up for herself, but out of compassion for the people who were saying the biased thing, he wanted to give them a heads up so they could knock it off. And then the fourth reason why he decided to do that, to be an upstander, was sort of self-protective. Because I think everyone has had this experience, probably multiple times a week, where this cringeworthy thing happens in the meeting, you don't say anything or do anything, and then you wake up at 3 a.m. thinking, like, why didn't I say anything? You suffer what is often called a moral injury if you're the silent bystander, because you feel bad. You feel like you got slimed by someone else's bad behavior if you don't say or do anything.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really impressive to be able to, I think that was a great way to handle the situation in real time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I like the snack man example too, just spilling
Yeah.
coffee.
Yeah, we can all spill our water.
And Kim, so what steps can leaders or organizations take to create this kind of environment where, diverse perspectives can drive innovation and people feel comfortable being upstanders?
Yeah. I think that people are never going to feel comfortable exactly being upstanders, but how can leaders create an environment where we push through the discomfort? I think one of the things that is really helpful is to think about how are we as a team going to disrupt bias when it happens in a meeting, when in the moment when we hear about it, because we are pattern making machines as human beings. And sometimes we make excellent patterns and sometimes we make bad patterns. And if we can disrupt the pattern in the moment, then we'll get more bad patterns and more good patterns and fewer bad patterns. And so what we want to do is not just ignore bias in the moment, but figure out how we're going to disrupt it without disrupting the whole meeting. So one of the things that I recommend that leaders do is to sit down with their team and say, what's the word or phrase that we're going to use when we notice bias happening in a meeting so that we can disrupt that bad pattern? In fact, I have it here. I like to wave a purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not a yellow flag. It's not a red flag. Other teams I've worked with, they like to say, ouch, and then giving the person who said or did the bias thing the opportunity to say, oops, and then you move on past the moment. So another team that I was working with had a cat theme. They like to meow at each other, whatever it is. But make sure that you sit down with your team. Like, don't try to be the word dictator. Sit down with your team and say, what is the word or phrase that you all will use in order to disrupt bias? This is not going to make it comfortable, but it's going to make it a little bit more likely that the team will push through the discomfort and disrupt the bias. I think the second thing it's really important for leaders to do is to work with people to figure out how to respond when they're the one who said or did the bias thing, when they're the one who caused harm. Because that is, certainly as I was writing the book, that was the most uncomfortable role for me to play, because none of us want to be the culprit. We all want to be the good guy, not the bad guy. And so I think that helping people realize that we all have our biases, and here's how to respond when someone points out your bias. Thank you for pointing it out, and either I get it, I'll work on not saying it anymore, or I don't get it. And this I don't get it thing is really hard to say because, at least for me, when someone points out to me that I've said or done something that's biased, but I don't even know what the problem is with what I said or did, I feel really ashamed. I feel ashamed because I hurt someone, and I feel ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. And yet, this happens to me, and it happens to all of us in this environment. We're working with all kinds of new people, and we're learning new things. And especially if you're working with younger people. I have kids who are teenagers, and I learn all kinds of new things all the time from them. And so learning how to respond that when, because I'm going to feel ashamed. If someone points out to me that I've said or done something biased, no matter how well they say it, I'm still going to feel ashamed. And I need to own my own shame by learning to say, thank you for pointing it out. And either I get it or I don't get it. So those
Yeah,
are
that's
some thoughts on, go ahead.
no, that's super insightful. I was going to ask, like, if you do get caught in a moment where, you said something that was biased or maybe even prejudiced, like, how do you react when someone is an upstander and tells you,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so when I'm the person who caused harm, I have an acronym for how to. I do not say this out loud, but this reminds me what I ought to do. And the acronym in my head is AC, 5 A's and a C. So the first thing I need to do is to be aware of what I did that was problematic. And that means sometimes I might need to do my own research. I need to figure it out. Ignorance is no excuse. The second thing that I need to do is to acknowledge what I did wrong as publicly as possible so that other people don't make the same mistake, and so that I'm showing that I have learned what I did wrong. The third thing that I need to do is to accept the consequences. Sometimes if I've said or done something biased, there may be some negative consequences for me. And if I try to fight them, then basically I'm going into denial. And the fourth thing I need to do is maybe go beyond the consequences to really make amends, to do more than I'm required to do. And only after I've done those four things can I move on to the fifth A, which is apologize, right? And then I need to try to change. But it's so tempting. I mean, I'll give you an example. I one time was giving a talk, and I was telling a story about that I thought was funny. And I thought it was funny, but I really offended. What I had said was incredibly biased. And I really hurt someone in the audience who stood up and gave me some feedback. But in the moment, I didn't know what was wrong. And I made the mistake of rushing to an apology instead of creating space to say, I thank you for telling me. I really don't know. I'm not saying I didn't do anything wrong, but I would like to know what I did wrong. And you don't have to tell me, but if someone else in the audience could point it out to me, that's what I should have done, but that's not what I did. And by zooming too fast to my apology and then moving on, it looked like I really didn't care. I was just trying to brush it under the rug. So you want to act, don't Darvo. Jennifer Fried has a really good acronym for Darvo: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And that is a big problem. And yet it's very a human instinct to deny what we did wrong when we learn that we've caused harm.
Absolutely. Well, Kim, thanks so much for taking the time to elaborate on all the important messages and learnings from Radical Respect. And we have a little bit of time left for Q&A now. And so I'm going to pull up the Slido link and share some questions that we have from the audience, if you're ready.
Perfect.
Right. Wow, we have a lot of questions in here. All right. So the first one that's very upvoted is, I have a hard time articulating how I feel when I speak to people in positions of power. I usually just cave because I don't want to lose my job. Any advice?
Yes. Thank you for the question. I feel that. I've done that myself. So I think that when you're experiencing bias, prejudice, bullying, or even discrimination, harassment, or physical violations from someone who is, either your boss or your boss's boss, or who has in some way, shape, or form more power than you do. I think there's several things that you can, eventually I'm going to recommend that you talk directly to that person. But in order to prepare for that conversation, I recommend first that you document what is going on. And if it's at work, you can create what's called a contemporaneous record by sending emails to someone you trust, not on your work accounts and not on your work machine. And if you're getting screenshot, if you're getting emails or texts or something that are really unacceptable, take screenshots with a personal phone to keep this record. Even if you have no intention of using that record in some kind of lawsuit, you want to make sure that you are really clear in your mind about the problem that you are experiencing. Because I don't know about folks listening, but so often in my career, when I have experienced really kind of nutty situations at work where I'm really being treated pretty badly, I begin to internalize the situation and feel like I must be doing something wrong. And I describe several of these instances in the book, especially the last chapter of the book. And so write down what's happening, just so you stay straight in your own head, like what's going on. Also, build solidarity with others. Talk to friends, talk to people you trust, talk to a therapist if you have one, because so often, again, we feel isolated, especially if someone in a position of power is bullying us. We feel isolated. So don't allow yourself to be isolated. Find people who you can trust. Find books you can read that will help you feel less isolated. And then the third thing I recommend is to locate the exit nearest you. As if you've flown recently, you're recommended to do. And the reason for this is because it is so easy to feel more trapped than we in fact are. So at least in my experience, and I want to acknowledge that I may be speaking from a position of privilege. Like it was always possible for me to get, not always easy, but always possible for me to get another job. I want to acknowledge that sometimes you're not in that situation. You are well and truly stuck in a job. But if you can figure out what would you do if you did have to quit? Is there somebody's couch you can sleep on? Because I think it's when we feel trapped, we don't often respond as strongly as we could otherwise respond. So often I'll be coaching someone who's experiencing disrespect from their leader, and they start interviewing for jobs. They have one foot out the door before they even realize what they're doing. So be explicit. Say, I'm going to figure out what I would do if this conversation I'm about to have doesn't go well. And that will give you an idea of what your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is. Because what I'm going to recommend next is a conversation that may feel like a negotiation. And you never want to go into a negotiation not knowing what your BATNA is. So now I'm going to recommend that you have a direct conversation with that person in a way that gives them the opportunity to fix the problem. Because sometimes the person is trying to be a jerk, and then you need to exercise that exit option. But there are also times when you explain to someone the impact of what they're doing, they fix the problem. They don't want to be that kind of jerk. And so have that direct conversation. The next thing, if that conversation doesn't go well, the next sort of tool in your toolkit is HR. HR, as Ernest said, is supposed to be a check and balance. They are supposed to fix the problem. And very often HR will. If you work at an organization where there's a wonderful HR person like Ernest, they will help you fix the problem. I want to acknowledge that not all organizations have given HR enough powers that they can be a check and balance. As Susan Fowler Rigetti wrote in her blog post about the way she was treated at Uber. At Uber, HR was clearly part of the problem, not part of the solution. But she kept going to HR, and she did that for a really important reason. She kept doing that because that was what demonstrated that this was not like one bad apple. This was a systemic problem at the company. And therefore her critique of the company had a lot more power. You can hire a lawyer, and you don't have to pay. Most lawyers will work on contingency in these cases. So you should certainly talk to a couple of lawyers. And last but not least, it's possible to tell your story the way that Susan Fowler did. She got another job, she told her story, and she had a huge impact. So those are a few thoughts on how to speak truth to power without blowing up your career.
Wow. I mean, super, super helpful. And we have a lot more questions here, so I'll try to get to as many of them as possible.
All right.
So one of them that's also upvoted: with global workplaces, how does one deal with bias and prejudice when it's cultural? Certain things may be acceptable in one culture, but inappropriate in another.
Yeah. I think the important thing here is to, when you're working with a team, for people to share with each other what their various red words are. So for example, it really bothers me if people refer to me as a girl and not a woman. It bothers me. It feels like the wrong answer on a SAT test. Like man is a woman, as girl is a boy. And I'm not going to call you a boy. I don't want you to call me a girl. We're adults. And sometimes people will say to me, "Oh, Kim, other women don't, other girls like it when I call, and I'm like, well, you're not talking to them, you're talking to me." So I think, remember, when you're on a team and you're talking to each other, we respect the individuals in the room that we're working with. And even if it's culturally okay to say or do one thing in a culture, if somebody is bothered by it, just don't do it. It was a really great mentor of mine explained to me about these red words. Like everyone on the planet has a red word. This is a word which, if I say it, you're not going to hear anything that comes out of my mouth for the next day. And so let's understand what those are and avoid them. It's easier for me to avoid saying that word than it is for you to avoid the sort of different and massive emotional impact that those words have.
Right. Yeah. And we're going to add one more question here. And then I don't know if you have maybe a few minutes afterwards, but if you do, we can ask some more. So we have a client who has shown some obviously biased and prejudiced thinking. How do you address client issues if it's not kind of internal within the company?
Yeah. One of the most transformative moments in my career came when I was working at a consulting firm, and we had a client come. There was at this client, there was one database administrator, and we needed to get data from him, and it was my job to go get the data from him, and he kept sort of saying, "Oh, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow." And then all of a sudden, one night I was staying, it was an out of town engagement. I was staying at a hotel. This database administrator showed up at the hotel. So I went down to the lobby, and he sort of implied, like, "I'm not going to give you the data unless you invite me up to your room." And I was like, I am not doing it for the data, buddy. And I told my boss this the next morning, and it never occurred to me that they would do what they did, but when they did, it made a huge difference. My boss said, "We will fire this client. This is totally unacceptable, and we will fire this client if the company doesn't take active measures to prevent this kind of thing from happening to us." And that bought me a lot of loyalty to that boss. It bought me a lot of admiration to the company where I was working. I was a much more engaged worker because they had my back. There's a lot of great stories about people who own restaurants who have come up with systems, red, yellow, green. So if a customer speaks to a waiter or a waitress in a way that is problematic but not dangerous, they'll throw down a green, and then another waiter will go. But if it's red, if they throw down a red card, then the owner of the restaurant would go and talk to the customer and throw the customer out. So I think you really want to have you want to have your employees' backs in this world. I think especially right now, there's tensions are running high, and the public is not always behaving the way that that we wish they would. So I think it's really important to have people's backs right now.
Absolutely. And Kim, if you have maybe time just for one more question, and then we
Sure,
can.
let's do one more.
All right. So how do you deal with suspected bias when it manifests as inaction? So being ignored or overlooked instead of, disrespectful actions or comments.
Yeah, yeah. This happens all the time. Sort of like the story where this woman was talking and the people were acting like the men had just talked, not her. Or someone will share an idea, and 5 minutes later, someone else will share the same idea, and everybody hears it the second time, but not the first time. I think one recommendation is to enlist some upstanders. Talk to people who will notice this happening. I was having a conversation with a pilot, an airline pilot, who's a woman, and every time she would go to the gate to get on the plane with her co-pilot, who was more often than not a man, the people who were to hand the paperwork to the pilot would hand the paperwork to the co-pilot, who was a man. And she learned, and it just became irritating. Like, she didn't want to have to, so she would tell the co-pilot, she would say, they're going to try to hand you the paperwork, assuming that you're the pilot. Do you mind explaining to them that I'm the pilot, not you? And the man was like, no, that's not going to happen. But it did every single time. And so asking him to be the upstander made it easier for the people at the gate. They were somehow less embarrassed when he said it than when she. But it also was an education for him, and it took the burden of there is an educational burden of like saying the same thing over and over and over. So enlist upstanders around you, because usually there's an infuriating aspect to this kind of bias where you get ignored. But once people notice it, but there's also kind of people get interested in noticing it and combating it. As I was writing this book, my husband was helping me read it, and often his jaw would be on the floor. He's like, I can't believe like all this stuff happens. I just didn't know, because it wouldn't happen to him and he wouldn't do it. So it was like impossible for him to believe that this was happening. And so helping people become more aware of how common this is really it's helpful to you. But he's like got interested in it. He was glad to know.
It's amazing. Thanks again, Kim. And I love the last comment here. Yay for the upstanders.
Yes, yay for the upstanders. I agree.
Perfect ending to the fireside. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate your time. And everyone, just before we leave, a couple of housekeeping items. So just follow our LIT Videobooks LinkedIn page if you want to find out about our upcoming author fireside chats. And if you're interested in learning how Lit for Teams ignites engagement and microlearning at your organization, you and your learning development and HR teams are eligible to try out our platform for free for 2 weeks. And so just go to our website, select Lit for Teams, and just share your information to learn more. And thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Kim. Hope everyone has a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ronak.